Stand by for an extremely educational conversation about the connections between cultural anthropology, safety, diversity, equity, and inclusion in building and maintaining a healthy organization with a psychologically healthy and safe culture. On this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. As workplace mental health has become a global priority, there's a greater focus on addressing psychosocial hazards. Each episode, we look at psychological safety from an occupational health and safety perspective. Let's talk Psych Health and Safety. Welcome to this week's Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. So cultural anthropology is a study of human patterns of thought and behavior and how and why these patterns differ in contemporary societies. Cultural anthropology is sometimes called social anthropology, sociocultural anthropology, and ethnology. Cultural anthropologists study how people share a common cultural system and organize and shape the physical and social world around them and the one that they're in, and in turn shape those ideas, behaviors, the physical environments. So the discussion that we're going to have today will definitely be educational for all of us. I myself am not a cultural anthropologist, but I do have a guest that is. And we're going to talk about the connections between this study of humans and how humans interact and how that study can help create safe, healthy, socially beneficial gatherings of human beings. So we're going to start with the typical question that I ask folks who come on the podcast. Who is Michael Flynn?
Well, hey, David, and thanks so much for having me here. I think there are a variety of different ways to answer that question. You know, I think on a personal level, I'm, white heterosexual male from, raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. My mother was born in Germany to Lithuanian parents and fled here after World War II. And my father was born in Canada to descendants of Irish parents and moved here around the same time as well, to Cleveland, not Cincinnati. On a professional level, I'm a cultural anthropologist and who's focused, for 25, 30 years now on issues related to inclusion and exclusion within society. And in the past 20 years, focused a lot on occupational safety and health and do research in that area. So I guess, and then, more recently, a friend of yours and just meeting you in some of these conversations we've had.
Right.
And so looking forward to spending the time here with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So another almost canned question, but I guess can't help myself. So what does psychological health and safety mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's it's kind of a big question. It's not particularly my specialty, but I would say, I think psychological safety for me is being in a place or an environment with other people. I think specifically the workplace here, is what we'll focus on, where you feel safe to be who you are and express your feelings, your ideas, your concerns that you may not always be agreed with, right? But people, when they do disagree with you, they disagree respectfully and provide rationales for why they don't agree with you. But it's a place where you can be you, and feel safe about that and not have to worry about, I'm here, but I have to watch my words, or I can't really bring this part of my background out or that part of my background out for fear of, people discarding it or thinking less of me. And then, of course, you get even beyond that to more hostile work environments, where people can really treat one another badly in a personal level, or just the way the organization is structured. But yeah, to me, it's a place where you can be yourself, and bring everything about who you are to the job that you're doing, and have that respected and listened to, but not necessarily always agreed with.
Yeah, and again, honestly, the question is not intended to ask for particular expertise in the area, but to really get exactly what you shared is your view. It's safety in general to me is very, very personal. I mean, it is. It is. I know there's lots of books and standards and policies and regulations and whatnot out there, but what causes one person to feel safe and what causes another person to feel safe could be very, very different. And I think that's, that kind of intersects with your, the other thing I want to talk to you about is, groups of human beings, when they get together, they create, an environment that is hopefully supportive of this collection of people, but it might not feel safe to everybody who's in that collection of people. Right. I think it sounds like one of the things that you study, but I want to ask, again, a little bit more specific question to your expertise. So how does a guy end up becoming a cultural anthropologist?
Well, I mean, I think I'd have to take it back to my roots growing up. The fact that I was a child of immigrants, I grew up in a kind of a small town that became a suburb of Cincinnati, and so I grew up there, and folks have been there for many of the people that live there have been there for generations, and so it still kind of has that small town feel, even though it's close to an urban center. But I guess even growing up, my world always felt bigger than that town. I loved that town. It was very much a part of who I am, and it's given me a sense of place in my life. But, we'd go over to my grandparents' house for Christmas or Easter or summer visits, and, everyone spoke a different language, and you'd hear stories about, escaping from the war, and you'd hear stories about my father's grandfather, who was a prospector in Canada, and so the world just felt bigger. And at some level, kind of getting a bit to what you're saying is, I didn't quite fit in because, like I said, when I'd come home from Christmas break at grade school and hear about other, kids' stories of what their Christmas was like, there were parts of mine that matched up with that and parts that didn't, right? Mm-hmm. And so I always felt that it was kind of weird feeling both in and out of sync simultaneously. And so then as I grew up, I went off, to college and really had never heard of anthropology till I took an introductory class to it because I had to fulfill a requirement. And just really kind of fell in love with just that you could study these differences and try and understand them and embrace a larger world, if you will. And then as time went on, after graduating undergraduate, I went to live in, I've lived in Mexico, I've lived in Guatemala, I lived in California, and have spent a lot of, the first 10 years of my career was in the nonprofit sector. And then I came to the federal government. And so I think a lot of just interacting with different cultures, folks from different ethnic and racial backgrounds, interacting with, different social classes within those different cultures and countries, and starting to see from anthropology some of the patterns of how inclusion and exclusion are created. I think one of the most significant experiences for me when I first went to study in Mexico, it was 1992, which was marked the 500th anniversary of Columbus coming to the Americas. And so and it's something that growing up where I did, it was something I'd never even thought about, right. But it was really interesting that over my time down there in dealing with, working or not working, but, getting to know indigenous communities there, started really, we know a lot of the history, but then asking kind of questions like, well, when did the conquest end? If yet, right? And so you can mark when it began, but when did that interaction end? And you realize a lot of folks there still speak, their native languages and carry on their customs as they do here in the United States. And then I started connecting it too and looking back in my own, ethnic background in terms of the Irish and reading some books. And so it's really an interesting mix of kind of a personal exploration of some of the similar dynamics, that happened in Ireland had occurred in the Americas as well, in terms of, imposition of language and a culture and things like that. And so it was really kind of it feels to me that the most success I've had, or what I attribute much of my success to, is kind of embracing, other cultures and other ways of beings, and then somehow connecting it and bringing it back to see what's similar or dissimilar to my personal and, extended history within my family and upbringing as well. And really trying to get a sense of rooting yourself within history and society,
Mm. Yeah, wow. You make me think about the fact that, even in our educational systems, there seems to be a tremendous focus on facts and figures and numbers and history and this and that, but not a lot, or maybe it was just me, but not a lot of focus on how human beings interact with each other, because ultimately all these facts and figures and stories and all of that, at least in my view, is really about how do we create culture and community. Through our different languages, our different, interests. How do human beings get together and solve our common challenges and coexist? But we get all this other stuff, which is about money and competition and war and who beat up who and who doesn't like who and that. And these people are that way. It's just an interesting thing we do as a species, I guess.
Well, and I think, one of the things I found, working with some other folks, I used to help run a volunteer program out in California for recent college graduates who would come and do a year of service, kind of like a Peace Corps type thing, but domestically. And we'd run a reflection component. I think the biggest, challenge we found, or the thing that I find most missing from my own, training in history, or like you said, the academic, classes in history, is seeing yourself as part of those historical moments or movements, and how it affects you. It feels like, when, like you're saying, just a repetition of dates or major events, you learn a lot about what happened, but oftentimes it's hard to see yourself within that, or your family story within those procedures or processes, right? And understanding, no, this had a concrete impact, positively or negatively, on the life of my family, and determined in some way, shape, or form how I'm living today, good, bad, or ugly. Right. And so I think it's really rooting yourself as situating, I call it like, defining your social location. Where do you fit in society, and how has that society formed and shaped not only you as an individual, but, like you're saying, those relationships within groups of people, who are the groups that you hang out with, and how are those different perspectives and groups treated by society writ large, in the overarching culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. And another thing I heard you say in your, your definition of yourself is this: your cultural anthropological studies have led you to focus on inclusion and exclusion. And so share a little bit more about where that, that part of your journey comes from.
Yeah, well, I think, it goes a lot back, like I said, from the very early ages of feeling like you never quite fit, because the stories I would tell about vacations would be a little different, than the stories that my friends would talk about, or, having spent time in Latin America and traveling or living down there, or having spent time in different communities within the United States, and just having that expanded, and then having to reflect, and understanding that each of the communities or each of the places you'd go had their own stories of, or their own reality of which group was, considered the normative group or the in group, and which group was the out group. And there are obviously unique historical facts on how that plays out in today's society. but then also recognizing that there were some overarching dynamics, that you could identify from one society to the next on how things happen. Like this idea of defining, who is the in group and what does it mean to be part of the in group? What is that identity, right? And I think when you talk about diversity and inclusion, a lot of the time we talk about, aggressive behaviors, insulting behaviors and whatnot. And I think that's all very real. But I think what I tend to look more at is just how, kind of the unconscious assumptions of the majority group and how that doesn't make space for the experiences of people who don't necessarily, share that. And of course, it's all intersectional because no one person is either totally in or totally out, right? I mean, you might be male, but you might not be white. You might be, and whatnot. So we have a variety of, identities that we're wrapped up in. And sometimes part of those identities were in the in or the privileged group. And sometimes part of our identity, we don't fit in that box. And so, the assumptions that are created, within society that do or don't match your experience. And so for me, taking, like I said, back to when I was a kid, the assumptions I had of what Christmas meant didn't necessarily match completely with the assumption that my friends had.
Right.
And
what about the folks who celebrate a totally different holiday or none at all? I actually looked it up in December, and if I'm not mistaken, there are like 53 holidays in December. I don't celebrate most of them, but that doesn't mean that they're any less valid because I don't celebrate them.
Well, and taking it back to me, like I was celebrating the same holiday as the majority of people, right? Christmas was, I'm a Catholic by upbringing. And even just the slight differences of going to visit my grandparents and speaking, them speaking a different language or the way they celebrated it, then you got to think, well, people have much more radical or different experiences of exclusion because like you're saying, they experience different holidays. It's not even the same holiday, right? It's a different holiday or whatnot.
Right. Yeah. It also, also this conversation makes me think about this interesting almost clash between diversity and inclusion, because to include people often, well, at least I felt, my experience has been for me to be included, I've often felt that I had to become like the group. And I wonder sometimes, why is it that the group doesn't have to become more like me if we're actually going to include me? And then on the other hand, the becoming like me actually makes you more diverse, because regardless to how we look or even how we think, there's something that is different about us. And so why is it that we can't have both? We tend to be forced to choose one or the other. We'll include you, but you got to be like us.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those overarching dynamics that go from one place to the next that I've seen. It happens in different ways, but the general thing is, well, this is the perspective that's considered the norm, and we'll invite you to join us or to hang out with us, but you're going to adopt that. You're going to talk, you're going to tell the same jokes, you're going to carry through the same assumptions, and and if you aren't, you're going to feel. At best, you're just going to feel a little off. At worst, you're going to be, punished for it or excluded for it, or like you said, having to deny some of yourself. And I think that's where, the difference between perhaps diversity and inclusion, diversity is getting folks from different backgrounds, within the same organization or social group or however you want to call it. Inclusion is letting them be who they are and bring that background with them. Right. And I think that's where you start getting into some of the psychological safety aspects of things, because if I can't be who I am in this environment, well, why not? Right. Well, because I don't feel safe doing that. And like I said, whether that's because either people are going to not sit. It's something as simple as not sitting next to me when I eat lunch, or not inviting me out for a drink after work or something, or, passing me up for a promotion, or worse. Right. And so I think that's really how do we create those environments? And I think much of the work that I see around diversity and inclusion, and it's very important, but a lot of it focuses on people from the normative group are trying to understand the other perspective, right?
Mm.
What is it
Mm.
about, African American culture or Latino culture, or, what's women's experiences of work and what, and all of that is, I think, is very, very important. But I think a component that's missing a lot of times in the stuff I've seen is really understanding that understanding your own culture and your own background, and
Mm-hmm.
how that, and the biases and
Mm-hmm.
the, how that circumscribes how you behave in the world,
Right.
Because I think one of the functions of, there are a million definitions of culture, right? And I won't bore you trying to give you a technical anthropological definition of it. But to me, it's, the easiest way to understand it, it's the box you're always told to think outside of. When it says think outside the box, well, what's the box? Well, that's by and large the culture you're in. And oftentimes we don't even recognize we have a box around us, because everything within the culture is situated to create a common understanding.
Yes.
Right. And it's like, well, this is how we see things. This is the normative experience. And so we're all going to jump off from that. And that is what's going to guide how we interact with one another. Right. So it could be something as simple as just defining family. When I say family, well, me and my family, went out. Well, I think the normative way to define family in this culture would be, 2 parents and 2 kids, right?
Right.
But we know that that's changed, but that's the general assumption, right?
Yeah. Well, two parents and, one male and one female parent. Yeah. That part too.
Well, in general, heterosexual couple, right? That's the assumption. It's a man, woman, and their 2 kids, male, female. Mm-hmm. And so, that's an assumption that carries out and impacts all kinds of interactions. It does. But you go to some communities and what they define as family, you're talking, that plus, grandma and grandpa who's living with us, or it could be, the aunts and uncles that are in the same neighborhood, or it could be, same-sex couples, with a dog, right? Or with 3 kids, who knows? Right. But I think, but it's trying to create some of those underlying assumptions or common sense, right? That facilitates communication at some level, but also excludes people. And then when you get to safety and seeing how that stuff's baked into, some of the social dynamics within organizations, but also some of the science that guides safety, you start realizing that it has some real world impacts, So for example, and I know you're aware, and probably your listeners are as well, but, personal protective equipment is by and large based on anthropometric measures of military recruits in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, right? So you're talking about largely white, young, male population between 5'5" and 6 feet tall. So if you don't fit that description, right, it's going to be harder for you to find personal protective equipment that fits well. Right. And that's the scientific assumption that says, well, this is what the average human being is, and we're going to design our equipment for that profile. And if you don't fit, you're an exception. You're the out group. Right. And oftentimes people aren't even aware of that, right? And so then it's like, and if you fit that group, then, you have no problem finding gloves that fit you, or shoes that fit you, or masks that fit you. You're like, well, that must be everyone's experience. Right. And until you start asking people from different backgrounds if that's their experience, right, then you just assume. And then I think that's one of the challenges of being part of the in crowd, right, or the in group, if you will. It's that much of the world is set up to align with your experience and your assumptions. And that's why it's harder to see, what those assumptions are, because you just think of them as universal, right? It's just the way things are. And you don't even recognize that it's not the way things are for you, not for others. And so when we talk, getting back to the original point of this whole diatribe here is, when we talk about diversity and inclusion and those things, it's just as important, maybe even more so, for us to recognize that we have our own culture and what assumptions we come with, or simply the fact that we bring assumptions two things with that, and things we consider commonsensical or universal or just the way things are not, that's not the experience of everyone. Right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And so the world is built to conform to, to the assumptions of some groups more than others.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I wonderful. I just love how you've, really gotten to the next area that I want to inquire about is how these, just ways in which we are born and, and cultured and exposed and, what's common for me, it starts to seep into the systems that we use that we say are supposed to keep folks safe. An example, and I say this one a lot. You may have heard it before, but when the Occupational Safety and Health Act was passed in 1970 by the 91st Congress, the 535 people who voted for it, only 2% of them were not male.
Yeah,
only 2%. So the dudes who okayed this thing looked at it and says, it looks good to me, and didn't recognize that it didn't really bother them that it said his work, his employment, his this, his, as if there were not women in the workforce even at the time. Right. And now 52 years later, the act is still written the same way to suggest that, well, it only applies when there are guys involved. I mean, and that's just one example, but the same applies to race. The only 2% of the folks who voted on this were not white either. So it is not surprising that that system continues to produce safety outcomes that are different based on your gender and race and a bunch of other stuff, because it wasn't designed for that. And when I say that, that's not critical of the great work of the act being passed and all the deaths is prevented, all that type of thing. But I think as a society, we too often go back to something that was created 40, 50, 70 years ago, and we keep trying to tweak it rather than trying to just start all over with something that actually is inclusive.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you're saying, it makes a lot of sense. And, the exclusionary structures in society or these limitations of what the in-group and out-group is and who's included making the decisions and who's, receiving the results of those decisions or living by those results, right, is different. And so those assumptions, like I said, kind of get baked into things. And so like even in toxicology, for example, as a science, a human being is defined as an 80-kilogram man. I mean, that's the scientific definition, and that's what's used as a baseline for all of the research, right? And so, how do we account, so the results of the science of toxicology are tailored more towards men than to women. And how does that affect, exposure limits? How does that affect, the reaction of this chemical in the body, and what's that impact, right? And women are simply treated in that model as smaller men. But we know that there's a biochemical difference between women and men, right? And so, but that assumption is baked in, and women are taught it just as much as men. Whoever's going through toxicology, that's what you're taught. And then it's reified as a scientific fact or a scientific, approach or concept. And so then you repeat it almost unconsciously because that's how you were taught to do the work. Right. And it's not until we really start questioning and trying to look and take apart some of these assumptions. And then once you hear it, it's like, well, yeah, of course. How can you not see that? Right. But you go through a lot, people go through their entire without seeing that. Right. Because they're not trained to look for it. That's right. So I think, and that's the thing about culture is, it really, we say it circumscribes, or it kind of puts a box around the way you perceive the world and how you act in it, right? The good thing, though, about culture is constantly evolving.
Yes.
And what that means is that with every interaction, we have the opportunity to either reinforce the box as it is or remake the box at least a little bit,
Right.
Each time we interact with one another. And I mean, obviously there are laws and much bigger things that in fact impact the box as well. But it's again, this idea of it's, it's there and it's very real, but it's also malleable, and
Right.
can change over time. To just looking at the role of women, for example, in the past 50 years, in
Right.
society.
Right.
Clearly that's changed, and it's unclear to know exactly how it all happened, but those things do change over time.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
I'm sorry, you were going to say?
Well, no, apologies for getting so excited and jumping in there, but even our laws. I mean, often the laws that have been put in place are used as a justification to continue to do things that some people feel are harmful to them. And here's, the example is this conversation right now around what, around just drug testing in general. Now, and I have to tell you, I'm one of those. I don't believe in it. I really don't. I believe that we should be testing for impairment in the workplace, but testing for drugs, to me, with based on my upbringing and experience, is simply a connection to the war on drugs kind of concept. It just is. But it's been in place for so long that even employers will take that mantle up and they'll use all the buzzwords. Yeah, we've got safety sensitive. Who said that was safety sensitive? Show me someone in your organization who has any safety expertise whatsoever to even determine that that was safety sensitive. No, you're using it to justify staying in the box. This is the box that we're in. This is what I learned when I was in high school, when they were talking about this is your brain on drugs. The people brought that view into the workplace, and now we're looking for a quote unquote drug addict around every corner. When in many cases, what you have is people who have not been kept physically safe, who got injured on the job and went out and got, diagnosed an opioid that they're now addicted to. And then when they get the addiction, then the same employer who didn't keep them safe wants to terminate them. So, you see what I mean? So it's all of these assumptions getting baked into everything we do. And I just believe there ought to be opportunities to go like, hey, do we still want to do that?
Yeah. Well, and that's part of the value of history and really understanding anthropology. It's teaching you how to try and see those invisible boxes that we carry around and try and identify maybe some of those assumptions that you're simply reinforcing without necessarily thinking about, And then of course, a key dynamic in all of this is power, right? And so, I mean, even just thinking about, you mentioned work, how the definition of what a job is and the relationship between an employer and an employee is changing, right? Yes. And how that's talking about psychological safety. I mean, what does job insecurity, how does that keep you? How does that related to psychological safety of employees, right?
Yes.
I mean, if I'm a temporary worker, right, who could be dismissed at a moment's notice, right? Or if I have a full-time, more of a permanent position, well, how I feel about work and life in general is very different. I like to use the example of like the college professors, right? So, if you're a tenured college professor, you have the same job title roughly as the adjunct, professor, but your job and the impact on your life and your psychological health, I'd imagine, is very different.
Yes.
Yes. Because you don't have the benefits, you don't have the safety, you don't have the security, the pay level, all of those things. And so, and I think increasingly we're moving to, less secure job arrangements in many ways. And I think that erodes some of the psychological safety as well.
Yes. Yeah, no doubt. And frankly, it's, I had the fortune of getting a government job at 21 years old, that told me if I stuck around for a period of time and kept my nose clean, that I would receive some form of benefit for the remainder of my life.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that, and even though there's for a lot of reasons, my benefit is not sometimes as large as sometimes even some of the people I work with, they think it is because of my moving around, but, it affords me the opportunity to do some things that a lot of people can't do. There will be something in my bank account every single month until I die.
Mm-hmm.
Until I die. Yeah. So that gives me I can say some things about, what's going on with employers and all that type of thing that don't really affect me. And I've honestly, in a little bit of self-reflection over the last couple of years, have tried to be cognizant of that and share with people that I say this because I can say it. You may not be able to, but the question is, when will you be able to? And are you interested in doing that? This is why a lot of people have decided to move into a tiny home, live in their RV or in their car, so they can have the freedom to not be exposed to some of the things that just don't feel safe for them. That people are making different decisions. People are taking different opportunities. And I really love to see what's going on with our Gen Z. And I think it'll go on to Gen Alpha as well. They're just not going to deal with that environment. They don't really want to do it. So they make other decisions for themselves, and they won't even take the job, regardless to how you define it, if they don't feel safe in terms of how they're treated.
Well, and some people can take advantage of this increase. It's not all bad, right?
Absolutely.
It's not all bad for all people. Let's put it that way. There are many opportunities to create ways of making money and surviving and making your way in the world that weren't available or would be less available, 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Yes.
Right. The question is, are those opportunities evenly distributed across the workforce?
Absolutely.
And oftentimes they're not. It's the outgroups, minorities, immigrants, women, whatnot, that are, disproportionately represented in some of these less secure, work arrangements, or have a less of, it's just those opportunities. How are they distributed across the population? I think that's where you start getting into some of the diversity and inclusion issues as well.
Yes.
Right.
So again, you've mentioned it a couple of times in our conversation. I believe that many of my friends and colleagues in the occupational health and safety space, some are struggling with this discussion about diversity, equity, inclusion, safety, how they interact or don't. There are those that believe, hey, that's not a safety thing at all. So what are your thoughts? Is there a connection? Is it not? Is it two separate things? What's your thought?
Yeah, I think one of the most common responses I hear is, well, that's all fine and good, but I treat everyone the same. Everyone, I just treat my workers or my employees as individuals, and I treat them all the same. And I said, well, that, while laudable at some level, you have to understand the world doesn't treat them the same. If you agree with me that, if we can agree that, toxicology is based on is using a male, 80 kilogram male as the baseline definition for their science. If you agree that, PPE is based on the anthropometric measures of white males in their 20s, from the 1950s, then I don't care how nice you are to your female employees, they're going to have a harder time finding shoes that fit, or gloves that fit them, which is going to make them less safe. Right. And because the world at some level is designed for men that fit that description, because that's the data we use to design the world. Right. Similar with artificial intelligence and autonomous driving vehicles, right? People with darker skin, those autonomous vehicles are less likely to be able to perceive pedestrians with darker skin. And so they run a higher risk of getting hit by, the automated driving cars or whatnot on the road. Why? Because those skin tones aren't in the sample when they test and develop the technology, right? Now, is that intentional? Is that a sign of intentional, we want to make this more dangerous for some people rather than others? No, I don't think so. I think it's just a dynamic of society,
Right.
of who happens to be in the room when they're designing and testing these things, or who they have access to test them. And, and the way our society is segregated, right? So I think on a very real level, at some level, we can, I like to just highlight some of these very physical manifestations of exclusion, because then it doesn't get to personal attitudes so much. Like I said, you can treat everyone, try and treat everyone the same if you want, but the world isn't treating them the same, whether it's gloves or automated cars or, whatever. There are things that, some people are treated better than others, or the world is built based on data that is tailored to some people more than others.
Right.
Now, when you start getting into things like, the interpersonal interactions, right? And then what makes a lot of sense to me, I think, for safety folks too, is that, by and large, safety is a technical field, and so talking about some of these social dynamics and how to understand power and privilege and exclusion and inclusion, and, it's not something a lot of safety folks are trained in, right? They're trained on how to measure air quality, or how to, lock out, tag out, these types, which are all very, very important, right? But you're kind of going further afield from your area of expertise when we start talking about, being inclusive, or creating a culture of inclusivity, even creating a safety culture, if you will. That's further afield than what a lot of safety professionals have been taught. And so we tend, the less training you have in these areas, the more you tend to rely on just the way society operates. And especially when we talk about things like racism or sexism or, inclusion and exclusion, however you want to define it, our whole society has opinions about those things, and you can talk about them with anyone on the street. It doesn't mean that, so anyone without training, everyone, regardless of training, has an opinion on this stuff, right? Yes. Whether they get it from the news or some guy, on TikTok, or whether it's actually something you studied and examined. Yes. And at some level, since the social sciences aren't that prevalent in the field of safety, right? I don't think a lot of safety professionals appreciate what social scientists can bring to issues like this, and so I think a lot of what happens is a lot of safety professionals simply rely on the common discourse out in the culture within their own social group on these things. And then they either, tend to go with that or not, depending on which, what their background is.
Yeah.
But if a key, why this is important is, one, we have to, just from a strictly safety and preventing accidents perspective, right? One of the key ways to prevent accidents is in generating a communication with employees, so that if they see something that's amiss, they feel comfortable reporting it and saying, hey, I think this is dangerous, or that belt's worn out, or I don't want to climb that ladder, whatever it is. If they see something that's not right, you want them to be able to communicate that with the line supervisor or the safety guy or whatever. If you don't have an environment that's inclusive, where everyone feels like they can bring their concerns to the forefront, then there are some people who feel more able or empowered to talk about their concerns than others do. And so, just like I said, just from an accident prevention perspective, not even talking about psychological safety, we want folks to feel included and able to bring those concerns that they see, regardless of, their race, ethnicity, gender, any of those things, sexual orientation, whatever it is. And that's the importance of, another important relationship between safety and psychological safety, or psychological, inclusion, right? Is how can I, am I free to talk about these things? One thing I talk about is the need for, companies to change. Like you were saying, it's not just about, back in the 90s when I started, doing some of this research on safety and health, there was a significant influx of immigrants from Latin America and Mexico in particular to areas of the country that traditionally didn't have them. And so it brought up all kinds of issues of language and whatnot. And So, you'd hear these, some safety professionals saying, well, I just have an open door policy. Anyone can come, if they have a concern, they know they can come talk to me about it. And I said, well, if they don't, I said, well, do you speak Spanish? They're like, well, no. I said, well, if you don't speak Spanish, how open is that door? Right. And so maybe what you need to do, or, if your workforce happens to be undocumented, right, and not have immigration stuff, right. There are all these things all these social barriers that might make them feel less free coming to you than someone who, was born here and speaks English, right? And so it's not just about saying, well, I'm treating them all the same. I have an open door policy. And for whatever reason, none of the Mexicans have any problems, right? Well, no, of course they do. They just don't feel free coming to you. And so you have to change your policy.
Right.
And now the onus is on you, in part, to reach understanding that there are these barriers that exist, right? What are you doing differently to meet them at least halfway, right? If not further. Right. So that you can get that input that you need as a supervisor or a safety professional from them. But it requires, folks changing and assimilating to some level, but it also requires change from the organization or, the folks in the in-group to do things differently, to be a more inclusive environment.
Yeah, I honestly don't believe that is equal, because I think it's more on the in-group than it is on the out-group. And generally, and again, some of these are certain opinions on my part, but if you want to include me, it's, I know who I am. I know I'm different, all that type of thing. But I simply want you to do for me what you've done for the in-group, which is make it, safe for them to be there, right? Because they're not all identical. They're similar, but they're identical. So you've made some accommodations that I'm just asking you to do that for me as well, and allow me to continue to be me while you're doing it. And I've suggested recently, I think, particularly, social organizations, whether they be for-profit, not-for-profit, whatever they are, ought to be in this constant state of evaluating what is us, what does we mean? What does that mean? And you can't do it every day, but certainly no longer, but every year, we ought to be looking at who is it that we are, who is it that we want to serve, and have we created spaces for both of those things to happen? You can't sell things to me if you don't know anything about my habits, about what I like. You won't keep me there if you don't create an environment where I want to stay. So it requires attention to that if you want to keep me. And the other thing I suggest is, and if you don't, just be honest about it. So we only want white, male, cisgender, Christian, blah, blah, blah. That's all we want to work here. And then accept that as an outcome. And then also don't be surprised when you go out of business. Exactly. If that's what you want. Because it's kind of hard to have it both ways. We're an equal opportunity employer until you actually show up.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. And I think that's kind of the intersection too, where it's kind of a symbiotic relationship, but that's where diversity is so important and inclusion are so important because, like I said, if culture's the box that you carry with you, that you're supposed to think outside of, and particularly if you're from the normative or the in group, it's harder to see that box. But when you aren't in the normative group, it's very easy to see that box.
Yes.
At least, you know what I mean? Because you don't fit into it, right?
Exactly.
So it's one of those, it's almost like a window where you're looking out, you don't know it's there, but when you're looking in, you see the whole frame around it, right? And of course, folks from the non-normative group also have boxes as well. So yes. I don't want to do that, but it's easier to see what the social norms are when you don't fit into them, right? And so that's why it's essential for businesses, organizations to be diverse and inclusive, because by bringing people from different backgrounds around the table and providing them an environment or a culture where they feel free to bring those observations to the table, that's how we start to identify some of those assumptions that oftentimes we don't recognize exist,
Right.
So if we have women sitting around saying, hey, man, I know we just got these new exoskeletons in, the robotic things to help us lift things, but man, I tried them on. None of them fit me. The
Mm.
pads are in the wrong places.
Mm.
You're like, oh, well, I wouldn't have never thought that because it fit me perfect, right? Well, why? Because it was designed for you.
Exactly.
So like I said, like
Exactly.
oftentimes you can't even see what's right in front of your face.
Right.
Right. Because the way it's set up is for you not to see it. Right. Because the way it's set up is to jive with your experience, not clash with it.
Yes.
And so by bringing folks, from different backgrounds, chances are increasingly you're going to have someone in the room. It's not going to jive, or it's going to clash with their experience.
Right.
And that's diversity. And then inclusion is them feeling empowered or safe to be able to talk about how it clashed with their experience.
Right.
So, hey, I'm sorry, that doesn't fit me. I mean, they're cool and all that, but they don't fit me.
Right.
And I think it's because I'm a woman.
Right.
Because look where the pads are. They just how's that going to work for women?
Or I'm a small frame male. Or absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, whatever you say. Yeah, or I'm 6'3", right? So every time I get on a plane, I'm reminded of at some level how I don't fit,
Right.
Although that may be more of a profit thing than an anthropometrics thing, but whatever.
Yeah,
I won't go down
that road. But again, and we're getting close to wrapping up the conversation. But I think that's another kind of convenient excuse that people use is about the cost of things. Money's only an issue in the absence of value. And if it's important, you're going to find a way to do it. I was listening to a podcast. It was actually during the pandemic where I had some Fed chairs, including at the time, the only Black Fed chair in the country. And he suggested that our economy has lost trillions of dollars of economic opportunity because of discrimination and excluding people. We've kept the market artificially small when we didn't really need to. There's lots and lots of ideas that could have been launched and businesses that could have been launched and products that could have been developed if we simply opened up and said, well, hey, we've made it for this group. What about these other hundreds of groups who don't have this? Do they need this? Well, yeah. Do they have money? Well, yeah. And, that kind of perspective, I think, it even helps the economic argument to me. Because it opens
to be able to reach them, it's going to be key to bring members of those groups into our organization, make them feel and belong. Because I can't just sit here and say, you know what, the African American community is an untapped market for us. Me and my, 3, white colleagues are going to think about how to sell our product to them, right? I mean, we can try,
right.
And it might be more than some companies are doing, but it's not going to work as well. And I think, there's the famous example of, that one company who they produced dog food, I think, and had 50-pound sacks. And they're like, well, women were like, well, we tend to hire men because women have a harder time lifting that amount. So then they changed it and they made their bundles 25 pounds so that they could bring women in. And what did they find? Is that their market share increased tremendously because who shops for this? And given women tended to go grocery shopping at the time, and they're the ones that bought these things. And they're like, well, if I can pick up this small one or this big one, I'm going to pick up the small one,
right? Or
maybe 2 of them, right? But I can lift. So I think so not all safety has to be. I mean, I think it's a core value, independent of a profit motive, right? But there are not only is the United States going to be majority minority, I think in 2042, something like that. Mm-hmm. And there's some states that are already there. But then talking about globalization too, how are you going to operate and produce things in other countries? How are you going to sell things in other countries? How are you going to work for companies, international companies that come here and relocate, but your boss is in China or Europe or wherever? How do you manage the internal social dynamics of the company you work for, of the market you're trying to sell to? If you only have or privilege one perspective and you don't create you don't have a workforce that's diverse and create an environment where they can bring that diverse perspective, their own perspective to this situation, and eventually create a sense of belonging and ownership of, well, this is my company too, and I want to see it succeed. Right. To generate a sense of, being something bigger than you're part of bigger. So being part of something bigger than yourself, right? And feeling included and belonging to that,
Absolutely.
and feeling like you fit. And I think that's getting back to the psychological safety idea. If you're constantly feeling like you don't fit, however hostile or minor, that grates on your psychology, and it creates an underlying, endemic stress that you carry with you that's detrimental to your health and well-being overall, right? And then, there's some environments and some individuals that are more hostile to diversity than others, but, even just, there's a grating frustration of not being able to find gloves that fit you,
Right.
And there's some things that companies can do about that, and there's some things you can't do about them because you may not produce those gloves, but maybe there are ways you can at least empathize with the employees, recognize that that's an issue for them, and then try and find some workarounds,
Yeah. My wife bought me a poster. It sits behind my desk and it says, "If it's important, you find a way. If it's not, you find an excuse." So it is about how important these issues are to people, how important it is. If you really want to get into people's pockets, get into their hearts. Yeah. If that's what you want to do. If you want to have, not everything is built for everybody. Not everybody wants a Maserati. So, and I don't think they're trying to sell to everybody, and all that's okay. But, even for organizations, be who you are and be honest about that. And if you really want to be, open to the world, be open to the world.
Well, and recognize you're going to have to change to do
yes.
Yes. You can still maintain a sense that you don't have to sell out, everything about yourself, right? You still have to be like, I'm very rooted in my own personal history, but how do I make connections with that, with groups that are where I find similarities and differences and expand who I am? Right. Rather than change who I am. But by expanding, it's going to require me to do things differently than I've always been taught. And that's going to be uncomfortable at times.
Yes.
And like you said, I think the onus, the more privileged you are in society, the more onus you have on you to change, because the world has been designed for your experience. And so you need to really be, chipping away and trying to make sure that we redesign it to include everyone.
Well, like the great philosopher Ben Parker said, with great power comes great responsibility. So, again, Mike, thanks for the conversation. And if you're watching this episode on the Flourish DX YouTube page, please do like, subscribe, and share with your friends. If you're watching or listening to the podcast for the very first time, welcome. I hope you've heard something that'll cause you to come back and listen to us or watch us in the future. Previous episodes of the podcast can be found at psychealthandsafetyusa.com. And please become a part of the Psych Health and Safety USA movement by connecting with us on LinkedIn. We are so honored and privileged to have you, Michael Flynn, with us, and you, our guest, with us. And we will hope that you'll continue to follow what we're doing until next time and the next episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Thanks very much for joining us. Tune in each Friday for new episodes of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. If you have a story or know of one that needs to be told, reach out to us on LinkedIn or send an email to david@id2-solutions.com or go to the Flourish DX website at flourishdx.com. We'll see you next time.